it almost looks really contrived simply for the purpose of demonstrating these skills of the artist. This actually was getting into a tough time for artists because the Renaissance had produced acknowledged masters, and we've seen the work of Da Vinci and Donatello, Michelangelo, Raphael. Other artists, especially as those people faded from the scene in subsequent eras, other artists, in trying to make a name for themselves, what were they going to do? Copy what these acknowledged masters could do, or innovate in novel and perhaps somewhat bizarre ways? So here we do see an inkling of what's to come in the future, the era of mannerism. People painting either in the manner of the masters or doing strange things. And it really seems that what happens is we get these eras following eras of greatness where innovation occurs, and in eras immediately following them, we get people who somehow want to embellish that or use it in ways that are novel, or perhaps, are novel and may build their interest based solely on novelty instead of the artistry involved. An interesting thing here is the fact that this artist has drawn two columns together, side by side. Actually, in an era that comes along 150 years later, this type of a feature is once again doubled. In the Baroque era, columns are doubled in a way that the Greeks never used them. And here we already see an inkling of that. So basically this painting is kind of an entree into the era following the Renaissance. All these techniques exist and artists use them, but perhaps in novel ways that strain credulity and build a reputation based on novelty more than artistry. And here we have, wrapping up with Hieronymus Bosch. Interesting thing about this is that whereas the artists of the paintings that we've seen in this unit used the techniques of the Renaissance to picture things in more realistic ways, things that they saw, Bosch used those same techniques to picture things that were imagined. In this case, the inspiration for them comes from the Bible. And he's illustrating here his interpretation of the Garden of Eden and the snake giving the apple, God banishing Adam and Eve from the garden, and then the other half of the fall of man, what happens to man after man dies, and all this horrible torture going on. Now, this is where it gets to be kind of a grotesque exercise in the imagination of the horrible. And it's no wonder that this type of artwork was used to scare people into following the dictates of the church, because the church was thought to be the way that one avoided this sort of a circumstance in the afterlife. Its artistry isn't as great as the artistry, certainly, of Renaissance artists, and its subject matter is grotesque and imagined horrors that people would really rather not have had pictured. So whether hell exists in this way, it existed in the imagination of the artist. Another very interesting thing that is a lead-in to the technology that follows this era. It's interesting that this was by Albrecht Durer once again, who had an interest in methods to achieve realism, methods of measuring the various parts of the body and then making new drawings based on those types of measurements. And here we have a way to study foreshortening and actually to kind of come up with a picture from a point of view where you connect the dots to get a more accurate foreshortened image of an unusually shaped object. So here we have a lute, this kind of an instrument with a neck and these tuning pins here, and then this kind of an unusually oval-shaped body here. It's from the point of view this is being observed more or less where this man is, but actually if you see this string, it's as if this is where there's an eye, and the eye is observing this object at the end of the table. So this string held on a weight here runs down to the tip of a stick that this man is holding at a particular point on this object. And the object is going to remain in the same position throughout this entire little session of sketching the dots. Now what's actually happening here is that this man is holding the string at a certain point. The string is running through this square frame. There's really just an opening there. But there's kind of a flap. It's almost like a window shutter. And this is on a hinge, so this man can do this with it and shut it across this opening, and it's carrying a piece of paper. Now what this man is doing is holding a pencil and holding his arm in just exactly the position where this string crosses the plane of this opening. And then this man will shut the shutter, and this fellow will use his pencil to put a dot on the paper where this string is crossing inside the frame. Then this man will open the frame up, and he'll move this stick to a slightly different position. This man will move his hand to where that string is crossing the plane of this frame. This man will close the shutter once again, and this fellow will put another dot. And this guy will go around, and he will do this at all these points on the object, and the string passing through that opening, the location of that crossing point, will be recorded by this man on this paper. And here you see the result of that exercise repeated many times, so that we now see an image forming here of dots where this line defined by that taut string crossed this plane as viewed by an eye that would have been at that location. And if you carefully connect these dots with a circular line, and here, you will wind up with a very accurate picture of this strange-shaped object foreshortened. So this was one attempt to use a mechanical means to aid the artist in picturing an object foreshortened as it's affected by linear perspective, and to do that in an accurate way. And in subsequent years, we find that other artists have refined this technique to use another mechanism called a camera Escora, which is really a pinhole camera, except there's no surface that can record the light. Vermeer, for example, is said to have used this to create sketches that he would then use as the basis for paintings, which were very accurate in terms of linear perspective with very difficult subject matter. And people have researched this and found that he probably had a camera Escora that might have been a pinhole camera, or it might have used glass lenses, which had been invented by that time, and could do a better job of focusing the light and make the image brighter. Subsequent to that, if you take a camera Escora and you do have a light-sensitive surface, like photographic film, we get to the point where images could be recorded entirely mechanically with a camera. That's a development that occurs a few hundred years after this point, but it's one of the major events that broke open the field of art to question whether an artist was necessary to create such extreme detail, as had been the goal of academic painters by then, or whether the artist could contribute more to the artwork by making it reveal his interpretation of the scene, his impression of the scene, which ultimately leads to the era of Impressionist art and modern art. Keep this mechanical instrument in mind, especially in connection with Albrecht Durer, because his approach was a very methodical one to the creation of very realistic art in applying the specific talents he had in woodcuts and engraving and other forms of artistry. And this concludes the lecture for Chapter 17.